By the time you realized no one was coming to correct you, your place was already slipping away. And once it did, it never came back. In this world, missing a lesson didn't hurt you immediately. It marked you, and that mark followed you long after anyone stopped watching. You learned early that no one was waiting to explain things. If you failed, the world didn't react. It simply moved on without you. In the Viking world, that lesson began as soon as you could stand. Not with an announcement. Not with permission. It began the moment someone noticed you could move on your own and decided you were ready to be judged. No bells rang. No one gathered children to listen. No one told you when learning started. It had already started, and you were already behind if you hadn't noticed. Childhood wasn't protected. It was watched, from the edge of the firelight, from behind the loom, from doorways left slightly open. Eyes were always there, even when no one spoke. You were measured long before you were taught, and this is where it became permanent. Most people imagine Viking children as wild and free, running until adulthood hardened them. That belief is dangerous because it hides what was really happening. What they lived under wasn't freedom. It was constant assessment, and there was no appeal process. There were no schools because the entire settlement was the classroom, and failure wasn't corrected with lessons. It was corrected with silence, and silence was worse than punishment. A child who could walk was placed near work, not to help, but to be observed. A child who could speak was expected to listen, because talking too early was remembered. Instruction was brief, often shown once, maybe twice. Then the watching began, and this was the moment you stopped being protected. Adults didn't explain why something mattered. They waited to see if you remembered. Forgetting wasn't punished. It was recorded. Not on paper, in people. And once it was recorded, it didn't fade. In a society without written rules for children, reputation replaced discipline. Every mistake stayed visible. Who dropped the knife? Who startled the animals? Who froze when the weather turned? No one corrected you in public. They didn't need to. These things weren't discussed. They were stored. What followed was quieter and worse. Viking children weren't raised to express themselves. They were raised to be useful. Not later. Now. And usefulness was judged by others, not by effort, not by intention. Responsibility didn't arrive at a certain age. It crept in slowly, like winter, until you realized you were already expected to endure it. A boy might be sent alone to watch animals, not because he was ready, but because someone wanted to see what he would do when no one was there. A girl might be given a task she had never been taught, not by accident, but as a test. No one corrected you in the moment. If you failed, the task simply stopped coming to you, and that was the warning. This is how learning worked. Opportunity was the reward. Absence was the verdict. People like to say Viking children learned by doing. What they don't say is that doing happened under constant judgment. You were always being weighed, against others your age, against older children, against the memory of those who failed before you. There were no records, but there were stories, and stories were the real curriculum. At night, when work slowed and the fire dimmed, adults spoke of ancestors, raids, journeys, betrayals, not for entertainment, but as warnings. A child listening learned who acted too quickly, who spoke when silence would have saved them, who hesitated and paid later. Names mattered, but outcomes mattered more. And children understood something early. These stories weren't finished. They were being continued through you. But this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when a child didn't fit. Viking society valued strength, but not just physical strength. It valued steadiness. Endurance, the ability to tolerate discomfort without comment. Children who complained weren't scolded. They were ignored, and that silence was deliberate. Attention was a resource, and it went to those who adapted quickly, to those who learned without asking. If you lagged behind, no one chased you, and this is where fear took hold. Not fear of punishment, but fear of being left behind. There were no second chances written into the structure. Some children were fostered to other households, not out of kindness, but as strategy, to spread alliances, to test children under different authority. A foster home didn't soften expectations, it sharpened them. You were watched more closely, judged more harshly. You represented not just yourself, but the family who sent you, and if you failed there, the failure followed you home. This is where paths began to narrow. Children were guided into roles early, not by choice, but by observation. A child who showed patience stayed near the loom. One who endured cold and silence went to the boats. One who listened carefully might be trusted with messages. Those who showed none of these traits were given fewer tasks, not because they were spared, but because no one invested in them. And that was the decision. This is the part rarely spoken. Viking society didn't rescue struggling children. It filtered them. There was no language for self-worth, no effort to equalize outcomes. Survival demanded efficiency, and efficiency demanded selection. You learned not because someone wanted you educated, but because the world withdrew from you if you didn't. And withdrawal was final. This is where the myth breaks completely. People imagine Viking childhood as preparation for violence. Most lessons had nothing to do with fighting. They were about restraint, when not to speak, when not to act, when not to show fear. Children weren't taught courage directly. They were taught what happened when you embarrassed your kin. Shame was the teacher. Memory was the exam. A child who failed publicly carried it forward, not as a story told aloud, but as a shadow that followed them into adulthood. This is why silence mattered so much. Silence meant you were watching. Silence meant you were learning. Silence meant you were not a liability. No one explained morality. No one explained fairness. Right and wrong emerged from reaction, from what the group tolerated, from what it turned away from. If the group relied on you, you were right. If the group withdrew, you were wrong. It was simple, and it was brutal. As children grew older, the watching never stopped. Only the tests changed. Could you be trusted to return, to finish, to remember, to hold something valuable without being reminded? This is where many failed, quietly. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just the gradual absence of expectation. By the time a child reached adulthood, their place was already decided, not by a final choice, but by hundreds of small judgments made along the way. This is why there were no schools. Schools assume everyone deserves the same knowledge. Viking society did not believe that. It believed knowledge was earned through usefulness, and usefulness was proven under pressure. The system worked. It created people who didn't wait for instruction, who didn't expect explanation, who understood their value through action. But it also created people who disappeared quietly, who learned early that the world had no place for them. Those stories weren't told. They didn't need to be. Every child already knew, by watching who was remembered and who wasn't.